Now, the only thing discussed less than World War One naval aviation, and the fact that quite a lot of the concepts that were used in World War Two started out in World War One, and were some of them were actually trialed in World War One and utilized in World War One, albeit in a very different scale than they would be applied in World War Two. The only thing discussed less than that is the fact that the Kaiserlichemarine operated carriers. Now, I've carefully titled this Carriers of the Kaiserlichemarine, but I will admit that the vast majority of the vessels they operated were seaplane carriers and seaplane tenders. Now, these vessels, these very interesting vessels, were subject to a lot of investigation post World War One. They really were. In fact, they're almost more significant to the development of naval aviation post World War One than they are during World War One. Because post World War One, the Navy which managed to get the hold of most of them is, unsurprisingly, the Royal Navy, which then gets to look at them. It gets to use the information it's gathered from having naval architects go and work with the Americans. The Americans, of course, had them come work with them, but the British have sent Stanley Goodall to go and work with the Americans, and he is a very, very sharp naval architect who ends up going on to design most of the Royal Navy in World War II. And, well, the British have seen how the Americans are tackling certain problems. And then their access to the ships of the Kaiserlichemarine, especially the ones which decide to sink themselves scarper flows so helpfully. It's always easier to not do anything than to do something to cause these things to happen, because if you merely get out the way and let it happen through inattention, no one can really blame you. They just get just annoyed with you. Whereas if you actually actively do these things, actively cause them, then there's blame to go around. But the war's over and our men were tired, and they didn't really think that the Germans, the Kaiserlichemarine, would do anything like that. Everyone can sort of understand. And the fact it goes in your national interests the best, because it means that in the qualitative race you've just secured another couple of cycles of advantage, because you've now got your view and what you've been developing and how you've been approaching problems, your examination of how the Kaiserlichemarine has been approaching and solving problems, and how the USN has been approaching problems, and you can put them all together and decide which way is best, on whether all of them are right from different perspectives and therefore it's a fusion approach, or all of them are wrong because actually look at what they're all missing. Is neither here nor there. But these vessels did exist. They existed, in fact, over the objection of large chunks of the Kaiserlichemarine. They actually objected to their existence. Which then will have a consequence going on for what the Reichsmarine, later on the Kriegsmarine as it becomes known. I know that the German Navy never just happily goes, we're going to be called this and we're going to stay there. No. They change. They just, it's not how they feel anymore. They decide they will be called something different. And so they do. Well, in this case, they keep changing. And one of the things, though, that stays the same is a similar approach to naval aviation. It really is a similar approach to naval aviation. It's always something which never really enjoys the full support. And when you add in some of the issues which I'll discuss when I do my review of the interwar era vessels, what are more commonly known as the German merchant seaplane tenders, which were a part of their transatlantic service, mail service, which is coming up in about a month's time, I guess. A month's time? I think it's about the 19th of April it's scheduled for. Even those, when they're taken into service, are taken into service by the Luftwaffe, not the Navy. Partially it's politics, because Goering runs the Luftwaffe. Partially, though, it's because the Navy really doesn't fight for them. they really don't want them. So carriers of the Kaiserlichemarine. James Booklog. Today is the last day. The entries close tomorrow for the competition, where 2 of these are open to win. And so tomorrow, probably actually I'll leave it till Thursday. I will open up the inbox. I've left it. I'm going to leave the email closed till Thursday. I'll open up, and whatever's in there are the entrants for the competition. I hope there are plenty. I could do with there being plenty of entrants, because honestly, I'd quite like something fun to read. I've spent a lot of my time recently having to read through a lot of legal documents, and honestly, I could do with the fun. So, why does the Reichsmarine inherit from the Kaiserlichemarine a lack of love towards heavier than air aircraft? Well, it's largely because they loved airships. They really did. They saw them as the perfect methodology. And you can see why, because on paper, they can fly higher, they can fly longer range, they can cover a fleet, they can provide you with a reconnaissance capability. They are satellites of their period. And Tirpitz loved them because he even thought you could bomb ships from them. Ships maneuvering at sea, underway. He felt you could bomb them from a Zeppelin. I'm just going to let that sink in for a moment. Tirpitz is a very interesting officer. I've seen some very interesting defenses of recently on various comments of the risk fleet strategy. One of which was, well, it caused the Royal Navy to concentrate the battle fleet in European waters. The battle fleet was always concentrated in European waters when there wasn't a war. It's very expensive to keep battleships outside of there. That's what you have cruisers for. So if you want to say, if the High Seas Fleet had caused a concentration of the Royal Navy's cruisers in European waters, then there would have been a problem. But concentrating the battle fleet, where is the best infrastructure? Where is the most infrastructure? Where is the cheapest infrastructure to use for the Royal Navy? It's all in Britain. Quite a large chunk is in the Mediterranean. European waters for the Royal Navy are great waters to be in. Great waters to be in. Because that's where you keep your battleships in for most of the time anyway. Because it's cheaper. It's cheaper. If you have the battle fleet sitting out off the coast of India, that's great, but the Indian Ocean's already a Royal Navy lake. At this point, there are no threats in the Indian Ocean. Australia, part of the Empire. India, part of the Empire. South Africa, part of the Empire. The French? The French Navy in this period, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have laughed, but yeah, no. They're not getting the funding to be something the Royal Navy's going to consider really a threat. And the Germans, to build the risk fleet, basically, they can only build battleships. There is a reason why, when you look at the video I did last year over the Battle of Jutland, the Royal Navy completely swamps the Germans in terms of cruiser presence. And they still have cruisers all around the world. And the Royal Navy has what most people refer to as pre-dreadnoughts, I tend to refer to as Royal Sovereign-style battleships. Already are all over the world doing other jobs at this period, whilst also concentrating the primary battle fleet in the Grand Fleet. And they have HMS Dreadnought sitting off with some of those ships which are normally from before her, the King Raiders of the 7th class mostly, in the Channel. Why? To block the Germans if they try to charge through the Channel barrier with the High Seas Fleet. The thing is, the British have enough ships to concentrate them. The problem with the risk fleet strategy was always twofold. One, you are trying this strategy on a nation which has historically had a two-power standard.
if they are happy to afford and spend the money to maintain a 2-power standard, then all you're going to do is manage to include yourself in one of those powers. And they're still going to have more battleships than you and whoever's number 3 combined. And even if they decide they don't need to do that, because all the number 3 powers are their allies, or they have a close enough, interesting enough relationship with them, i.e. America, that frankly, no. For war to break out between Britain and America, I know there are historians who look at the Anglo-German naval race, this huge quantitative naval race where there's a lot of fear and a lot of anger on both sides, a lot of outrage, especially on the British side, because this was our traditional ally turning against us and building a navy to challenge us. And go, well, you know, there's also a naval race going on between Britain and America. But look at it, it's a qualitative naval race. People go, the Germans and the Americans were building all these 16-inch battleships. The British had a whole load of 15-inch battleships. And are planning a whole some 16.5-inch and 18-inch battleships. Gun battleships. This is what those two nations do at that time. They engage in the shipbuilding equivalent of top trumps. You've got 16-inch battleships this season. I have 16.5 and 18-inch battleships next season. And then the Americans would respond, probably with their own, probably 18-inch battleships. And then the British might respond with more 18-inch battleships, or they might respond with, I don't know, a 19.5-inch battleship, or a gun battleship, or something like that. Who knows? But that was the relationship. It's more of a case of, honestly, it's two bald men trying to outwig each other. That's it. That's the entire relationship. So yes, there is going to be some sparring. There is going to be some but it doesn't have the heat to generate a war, unlike what Tirpitz created. But Tirpitz had a lot of problems in his worldview, not just the risk fleet theory and pushing that and the pushing naval laws. I would argue he also has a problem in his love for Zeppelins, because he looks at them as they look on theory and look on paper. It's kind of like his risk fleet strategy. His risk fleet strategy works as long as the British do not respond. You can do that as long as the British do not use their infrastructure advantage to churn out ships, i.e. when they order 8 Revenge class on top of 6 Queen Elizabeth class and all the other ships they're building, and you just can't keep up with that. You can't deal with that volume and that constant ability to escalate. Well, it's the same with Zeppelins. On paper, you've got this great capability. In reality, even with radios, etc., coordinating them with the fleet below is very, very difficult. And honestly, there are sections of the High Seas Fleet which work this out and start trying to push forward. And they realize that the most difficult thing to move, the least mobile thing known to mankind, is, at this point, any aviation base. I know in World War II, Churchill says it's a heavy bomber squadron, but in this period, any aviation is very difficult to move because aircraft are experimental and they need a lot of facilities to support them. So what do? Well, there you go. Merchant ship conversions. And please note, I'm going to skip Answald a little bit because of what I've got coming next. I couldn't find many decent pictures of these vessels. I honestly couldn't. I've been hunting for them. But what I could find were some drawings of them, and so Navypedia, blueprints.com, thank you. I'm not sure, having read your terms and conditions, whether I'm allowed to use this or not, so I'm hoping you won't mind. I'm hoping, as it's for education purposes. So we'll start off with the St. Helena, which was a merchant ship which was taken up for conversion for the Baltic Fleet for their service. It would displace 13,900 tons. It would be roughly 137.7 meters long. It had quadruple expansion engines and free boilers supplied by free boilers driving one shaft with 2,800 indicated horsepower and a top speed of 11 knots, so it was fast. It had no armor. It had 122 crew. It had a couple of AA guns, not really that many. Usually carry between 3 and 4. Seaplanes had a maximum capability of 6. It was fitted with hangars and hoisting booms fore and aft. It was initially deemed unsuitable for service after conversion, and it had to be modified further before its commissioning. And the thing is, when you start to look into these ships, they don't come into service that early. It was converted and commissioned in July 1915. It was served in the Baltic. It was officially surrendered to the Royal Navy and then handed over to the US Navy in 1919. But the US Navy really didn't look after it for that long. They sold it into merchant service almost immediately. It would be renamed Linois, then Orevito in Italian, 1924, became property of the German Navy again in September 1943, following the Italian surrender, and ends up being sunk at Marseilles in August 1944 by either bombing or scuttling. It has an interesting time. Then we have the Oswald. The Oswald is another small merchant vessel taken up for conversion to a depot ship. Then it's later in the war converted into a seaplane carrier. So it starts service as a depot ship. It is taken over as a minesweeper depot ship and in 1917. It's used as transport in most of 1917, and it's converted to a seaplane carrier between February and July 1918. Finally commissioned as a seaplane carrier in 17th of July 1918, and the British managed to get her. Surrendered to the UK December 1919, officially. Would eventually end up in 1924 after it's been studied quite heavily by the Royal Navy as the Ian Maru in Japanese service. Be sunk by US Navy aircraft in July 1945, I think. There's a dispute over it's the US Navy or the US Army aircraft. Some sites just say US aircraft. I would say from the timing I think it's US Navy, but I could be wrong. I'm open to being corrected by people if they have more accurate details. But of the accounts I've read, 3 have given good timings, which seem to suggest US Navy. 1 has given a good timing, which suggests United States Army Air Corps. And then we have the Adelaide Hugo Steins 3. Now, that was 2,709 gross registered tons. It says has a vertical triple expansion engine, a single shaft, and 1,700 indicated horsepower, with a top speed of 10 knots. We are not quite sure of its crew strength. Its armor we know was none. Its armament was probably none, and it had 3 seaplanes.
After that, we really don't know what happened to her. We really don't. We know she's launched in 1909. We know she's taken over for conversion in 1914. We think she's finished for conversion in 1915, because originally what she was going to be converted for was a depot ship, and then that's changed to a seaplane carrier, or tender. There are no photos available that I have found that I can positively ascribe to her. There are no plans I can find that I can positively ascribe to her. Positively ascribe to her. If you look up here, there is a picture of the Unswald. That's the top there. That is from Wikipedia. So, as normal, if I've got a picture I've managed to find in common on Wikipedia, that's up there. But these 2 pictures, they're from Navipedia. This picture is from Blueprints. And I have got St. Helena, I have got Oswald, I've got Glinda, I've got Answald. I haven't got Adelaide and Hugo Staines. I just haven't. I haven't got aniline. She is, in many ways, an invisible ship. We're not sure what happens to her. And I've tried hunting through some German and language sources. They're not any help either. She seems to be like many vessels in World War I and World War II. If she's not part of major operations, she's kind of forgotten. And I think she probably plotted around the Baltic and did things there with free seaplanes, assisted when helpful, but wasn't really much use. Because let's be honest, free seaplane doesn't allow you to do a lot. And probably ends up sitting in a harbour operating as a more of a moored base than a mobile basing facility, if that makes sense. And we have Glinda. Now, Glinda was actually armed with some 4-pounder guns and some 105mm howitzers. She had triple expansion engines, 2 boilers to supply them, and a single shaft, 1600 indicated horsepower and 10 knots. Crew of 91. She has what can best be described as a very minimalist conversion. Seaplanes were stored in the aft well deck, hoisted with cargo booms, no hangars. She was rendered unusable and unserviceable by mine damage in 1916. Now, her story begins with her interment during World War I in 1914. And she is taken over and modified as a seaplane carrier incredibly quickly, which is probably why she has such a bare bones modification. She's commissioned on the 16th December 1914. She serves in support of the Baltic campaign. She is mined in June 1915 and partially repaired, and is then used as an auxiliary hulk. When she is eventually surrendered in January 1919, she's sold into merchant service as the Akenside. Then later on renamed the Aegir Vivara in the 1920s and scrapped sometime in 1955. She's a useful merchant ship. And that's pretty much the merchant vessel conversions. However, we have the Answald. And the Answald is, as you can see here, it's available in scale models to buy, so if you really do want a very cool little ship to add to your World War I wargaming, I highly recommend. The link will be down below. Please go look at it. When I found it during the preparations for this video, I just looked and went, that is cool. If I wasn't moving house and therefore risking breaking every model I already have, I would be buying this to wargame with, of course. Now, the Answald, it's another small merchant ship converted to a seaplane carrier for the Baltic service. Displaced 13,200 tons. Carried 2 to 3 seaplanes as normal, but 6 was the maximum. Fitted with hangars and hoisting booms fore and aft, as you can see. Also fitted as a torpedo boat tender. Initially deemed unsuitable for service after conversion again, and went through modifications prior to commissioning. Those works are done by the Danzig Kaiserliche Werft, and she's commissioned the 17th of July 1915. She serves in the Baltic. She surrendered to Britain in 1919 and is sold into merchant city service as the Vulcan City sometime post-war. Scrapped in 1933. Vulcan City does not have a long merchant career. These ships are intriguing. They're interesting. They are the capability the Kaiserlichemarine seems to be searching for more than anything is reconnaissance capability. Air defense and reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is the criteria, though, and that's what these ships are operated around. If you think about it, with air defense your priority, you are going to be looking, especially in this period, for a method of rapid launch. You can't yet design aircraft for combat air patrol. One of the interesting things and conversations I have quite often with people say, so when does the Royal Navy start to develop its tactics? You know, is it a result of the Battle of Britain, or is it a result of this and that? And my response is, look back to World War One and the trouble they are having with maintaining fighters over the fleet in World War One. And then look at what they're doing tactically in the 1920s and 30s, where they try it by having single-seater fighters that can launch fast and get up in the air, and having fleet spotter reconnaissance aircraft up in the air with people with binoculars looking out, trying to spot the enemy flying in to send down the radio message. There is not much of a development jump to end up with two-seater, slightly heavier fighter aircraft that have the endurance to sit up there themselves and also look around themselves with their own their own sort of second crewman and pilot looking around to see if they can spot the enemy coming in. And then once you add in radar, which actually will detect the enemy, then they can be waiting up there, and then the air controllers can position them to where they need to be. It's a very logical and very sensible progression. It's not a great leap. It's sometimes it's almost more difficult to explain that, because everyone wants there to be a point of inspiration, someone to point to go, this person had the flash of idea. But no, air defense at sea like that, and that development is more of a progression of thought and a progression of the technology to actually carry that out, and how they're approaching it. Because again, pre-radar, what's the thing you're going to be using? The Mark 1 eyeball. You're going to be looking at using that. So again, these things all make sense. But because of that, we can then look at the Kaiserlichemarine systems and can go, we know what you were up to with these ships. We know what you were looking at for these ships, what you wanted them for. Because, again, this is some of the point of forensic engineering. You're looking at design and going, what's the design orientated around? Have they put in some sort of launching system to rapidly launch aircraft? How are they positioning? How are they organizing them? It's a very methodical launch system. It's a very methodical recovery system. Well, methodical launch, methodical recovery means it's not something which you're talking about being an alert system. So probably not strike unless it's planned strikes. Maybe some air defense from a fixed locale, where they don't always have to they don't always have to be hoisted back aboard, but probably not much. But reconnaissance, yeah, they can be dropped off, launch, come back, pause to pick them up. That makes sense. It really does. And then we have the warship conversions, because at a certain point the Germans go, you know what, we need something to actually keep up with the fleet. The trouble is, the Stuttgart is converted between February 1918 and May 1918, and then is stricken in November 1919, surrendered to the UK in July 1920 as Prize S, scrapped in 1921. Again, the Rouge had a nice look at her. And this is before we get on to the Rune. And the really fun thing about the Stuttgart is she could do 23 knots, the Rune could do 21 knots, they're both cruiser conversions. The Stuttgart was 3,800 tons. The Rune is approximately 10,000 tons. She was obsolete as a cruiser, but they felt maybe as a seaplane cruiser she could provide scouting duties. And so they start converting her. But they're converting her from a disarmed accommodation gunship, which is what she'd been rendered in 1916. And they're doing this plan in 1917, but it's cancelled because they're running out of funds. Again, the Royal Navy's very happy when they find the plans and the ideas.
in their works later on after the war's over. So these are about trying to provide reconnaissance with the fleet. Again, I'm not sure which is going to be better. The Rune technically can only do 21 knots, not 23 knots. But as she's larger and heavier, she can probably hold her speed better in rough seas. And let's be honest, the North Sea is very rarely calm. So I think she might have been the more advantageous one for the high seas fleet. It's interesting to think, it really is interesting to think, that her conversion plans come about after the Battle of Jutland, when they really do realise that, hang on, the hoped for reconnaissance and support to be provided by the Zeppelins just isn't providing it for the fleet. It just isn't enough. It just isn't the capability we need. We need more. We need something else. It's also the time period where they really start to do some work on this. And yes, I know, it starts in 1915. Technically, this is the first ever German aircraft carrier. She's built at Blohm + Voss in Hamburg, construction order number 236. And at the time of her ordering, and originally she was ordered by the Italians as a turbine-powered passenger steamer in 1914. At the time of her ordering conversion, the Kaiserlichemarine only had the Friedrich Karl, which carried 2 seaplanes. So, she's paused. And then they start work on her. They start work on her because despite the preference towards airships, despite the love of Tirpitz towards airships, they have Hansa Brandenburg, who are a company I'm going to be doing a bit of a deep dive into their aircraft Model 1 in a couple of weeks in part of the Key Aircraft series. And those are some very good machines, which they really, really do like. And they include some very good fighters. Some very, very good fighters. The plan for the conversion is drawn up by Lieutenant Zassi Jürgen Rempel in 1918. And they basically are deciding to take the Ossoria, which had already been launched in 1915, and convert it into a flight deck carrier for wheeled aircraft as well as float planes, so it could take off and recover both. It was to be 149.6 meters between the perpendiculars, 158 meters overall. It was to be equipped with 2 82-meter long hangar decks for wheeled aircraft, and a third 128-meter long hangar deck for seaplanes. All hangars were to be 18.5 meters wide. The flight deck would have been 128.5 meters long by 18.7 meters wide. All 3 of the hangars and the flight deck were to have been mounted above the main structural deck to allow the ship to retain its strength as was and to allow for minimal conversion. Erich Groner, who's quite an eminent naval historian and someone who I enjoy reading the works of occasionally, decided that the ship, as from his work, has decided the ship was designed to carry either 13 fixed wing or 19 folding wing seaplanes, along with around 10 wheeled aircraft. Peter Schneck seems to concur with this. I have to say their books are interesting. Groner's, of course, which I'm going to give you now, I'm referencing it, is German Warships 1815 to 1945. Schneck wasn't a book, it was a journal article, wasn't it, in Warships International. It was German aircraft carrier developments. It's published 2008. Pages 129 to 158. And there's also another historian, Gregor, who I think wrote again in German in a journal article, German seaplane aircraft carriers in both World Wars. They're all good works to try and read if you can get copies of them. I was quite lucky with being able to get copies of them to read for this. I don't agree with necessarily everything they say. I will admit that. I think at least one of them is more ambitious towards German capabilities than they actually were capable of. But saying that, And this is something which it's important to consider when looking at this.
The German Navy, the Kaiserlichemarine of World War One, has proportionally a far greater infrastructure base to work from, has a far greater industrial reach to work from, has far less political competition for support and capabilities, and has far more... how do I put this politely? Far more ability to achieve what it wants to achieve than the Kriegsmarine of World War II. The Kaiserlichemarine also comes closer to winning the war than the Kriegsmarine does. That is the absolute truth. The Kaiserlichemarine comes far closer. The exact realization of how close they come with their U-boat campaign to knocking Britain out of World War One is something which I think most British historians are uncomfortable with. Especially the non-naval ones who've written about the war. They often have reasons for why it wasn't going to work, and the sheer quantity being sunk at just before the convoy system's introduced is getting on for obscene. It's getting on for the point at which it's not replaceable and not sustainable. That, of course, quickly changes with the convoy introduction system and the escorting of convoys. And later on, the American and Japanese anti-submarine warfare groups doing their roles in the Mediterranean and the Irish Sea, respectively, and the North Atlantic, assisting the Royal Navy. It's all useful. Combine that with the growth in anti-submarine warfare capability, depth charges especially, and their growing viability changes things back and pushes things back and makes them comfortable. But we talk so much more about the ones in World War II and the campaign in World War II, which was scary at points. As Churchill greatly says, it was the only thing that kept me up at night, although there's so many things which were the only thing which kept him up at night. It's a bit of an overblown statement. But honestly, in World War II, it was the spectre of what they'd achieved in World War One, which was the scariest thing. As much as they did achieve in World War II, thanks to various systems, various technologies in place, ASDIC, the sheer quantity of escorts being produced, the sheer quantity of merchant ships being produced at various points, and the intelligence advantages which were felt most best in routing, for example, of convoys. All these things added up. In World War One, that stuff all had to be developed. That stuff wasn't available. Or rather, had to be re-implemented by a navy which had decided it didn't need to do convoying because that would muck up the day of all the merchant ship companies, because they'd have to wait for a convoy rather than being able to plan their routes when they wanted to do most efficiently. Yeah, that was terrible. But honestly, no, the Kaiserlichemarine is pushing forward. The trouble is, again, then post World War One, a lot of the Kaiserlichemarine's officers who were really good at this stuff, no longer belong to the Kaiserlichemarine. And they lose a lot of institutional memory. They really do.
For example, Rempel himself, I'm not even sure if he stays in the German Navy post World War One. Honestly, I lose him. I have managed to track him down till about 1919. I have no idea where he goes after that. But that's the thing is, the odds are that means he doesn't stay in the Navy. Because hunting through a lieutenant at sea who's this senior in 1918, by World War II, that's 20 years later, I'd be expecting him to be a captain. And that's a very small number of personnel for me to hunt through. He's not there. I'd expect him to be some sort of senior rank. He's not. So here's the interesting thing then. If it hadn't been for Tirpitz's opposition, they have this vessel sitting around from 1915. They could have had it in service by 1916. They could have had something in service. And I know, and I'll be talking about them, I said, in a future video, I know the Hansa Brandenburg aircraft in 1916 are not what they're going to be in 1918, but they're pretty darn good for aircraft in 1916. And Hansa Brandenburg is one of the largest aviation companies in the world, let alone in Germany at that point. It's got 3 full factories. It's got 1,500 employees. I'm going to do a whole video about them. It's massive. So it could produce some good aircraft for them. It could do. With that as the option, and considering all the stuff they have available, there is a very real scenario where the German Navy could have had a carrier like this. And this is one of the areas where they were innovating and were pushing forward. They could have had a carrier like this available for the Battle of Jutland. I'm not sure how that changes things, because whilst it's going to mean that Scheer will know earlier on that the Grand Fleet is coming. So he might just turn around and go away then, because his whole thing is he doesn't want to get into a fight with the whole Grand Fleet. He wants to break the Grand Fleet up into bite-sized chunks and divide them bite by bite, not try and take on the mass. So it might just end the battle, and probably would do. But there's also the very real reality that if the Germans had pushed through this, British intelligence, naval intelligence especially, would probably have picked up its existence, and the Royal Navy would possibly have responded by pushing through their own. We could end up with a Battle of Jutland, which is a carrier battle. You could have ended up with that. It'd be a very interesting carrier battle, because, well, they both were fielding torpedo bombers by that point. They don't have dive bombers or any kind of bombs which are big enough to actually damage most of the larger warships, so that doesn't matter, but it could probably damage their carriers. It's a really interesting potential scenario. Pre-radar naval aviation engagement. I think that's going to be the question this time. And this whole video is more about what could have been and what we know fairly securely about what they were doing. If you want to read more, and I'm going to put a link down below to the Weapons and Warfare German Naval Aviation article. Again, I can't, and I wouldn't like to say I agree with everything on there, because if I did, then there's nothing for me to write. But there is some very good stuff there as a good basis for you to go and look further. And I felt having a link down there would be something interesting for you to follow up with. Thank you very much for watching. If you like the video, please like it, maybe share it. Comments are good. Liking and commenting are very good for the algorithm, very helpful to promoting a video. Sharing is also very good for the algorithm. Basically, all these interactions are very good. So please do. If you'd like to support the channel and my book addiction, and the fact that I have found some books which might actually have the clue to this, but and where these things are, but they are currently, the cheapest one I can find is in German and is £300. So, that a moving house, that's not on my purchasing the thing for at least a few months, and that's if I get some TV work probably. Thank you very much for your support, but as I said, if you do want to support the book habit, which keeps all this going up, Patreon, Ko-fi, you're up there. There's a vote currently going live for the patron choice of May, and once that's through, it'll be open up to suggestions for June.
So people will be able to suggest what topics they want to discuss in June. Which could be announced to be slightly interesting. June and July might be interesting ones this year. June and July might be a case of, for both of those, it's going to be the top 4 topics, vote-wise, will get a recorded video. Rather than guaranteeing the Thursday lives. Because I think I can maintain most of the Sunday lives through June and July. But I'm going to be moving around enough, and there's going to be enough moving parts going with housing and all sorts of things, that I might want to... The Thursday lives might have to go to recorded videos or premieres for those months. Which is always a bit annoying, because I like doing lives. I think lives are a lot of fun. And I think lives are a very good way of interacting and saying thank you to you all. But yes. So we've got coming up. Next week we have... What do we have? We have the first carriers, conversions and scratch builds. Which is why this one is a fun topic to have before it. Because the Germans have this plan. Okay, yes, it originates in 1918. But... when you look at the works of Lieutenant Zassi, Jürgen Rempel, when you look at his works, and, well, rather the discussions of his works I've found, he seems to have been toying with the idea for quite a while, and there seems to be a fair number of others who've been toying with the idea. So, saying it could have happened earlier, it could have been in service by 1916. A version, probably not as capable as this conversion will have been, but a conversion of it. Well, I don't think that's overstating things. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.